Okay, this video continues in on our series of basic drafting and design in AutoCAD. Um, so far we've covered the bulk of the main drawing tools you'll need. Um, Main shapes, the modification of those shapes, etc. Um, and now I want to spend some time talking more about the physical properties of each of these shapes and how we can manipulate those and just where we can even see those in general. Um, and to do that, there's a couple ways to do that. Um, but first, I'm just going to start talking about each individual feature we draw. So, for instance, we draw a line or we draw a circle. Now, we've already gone over that we can specify certain features about them. We can specify start points, end points, and because we're on this 2D scale, this 2D grid essentially, there is a known location for that point, and there's a known location for this point. There's also a length of this line. There's an angle of this line. Similarly, for the circle, there is a center point somewhere in space, that there is an XY coordinate for that center point. There is a radius for this circle. And so they have these individual features. Um, but obviously, once we draw them, we have no idea what that is. Except there's obviously a tool for that. There's actually a toolbox or dialog box that pops up. Um, and there's multiple ways to get after it. You can click on any object. You can right click. And you can scroll down here to properties. And so we have a properties dialog box that pops up, sorry. Okay, and it's right now it's very specific to our selection. So it tells us up here what we have selected, which is a circle. And we'll get into this in a minute, but we can set colors, layers, and this general area we'll discuss in just a minute. But those are the layer properties essentially. And then now we get down and it has the geometry properties. And so it tells us what are the XY coordinates of the center. And if we had Z coordinates, it's there as well. Okay, it tells us a radius, obviously diameter, circumference, and it gives us an area. So these are pretty handy things to know. So let's cycle over and select our line. So similarly, now our properties toolbox is telling us we have a line. Again, we'll discuss this layer information, but it's still here. And now for the geometry, we have a start point, which has an X and Y, and technically a Z. And it has an end point, X, Y, Z. Okay, now the delta here is basically the change in X in each direction. It's not super relevant, but obviously that can, if you use all those calculations, you can calculate the length. But it has a length and it has an angle. Now, one thing to note, some of these are grayed out here, and some of them are lighter. Now, when you click on the grayed out ones, you can't do anything. But when you click on the white ones, these are attributes you can change. So we can physically change the start and end points, but we can't change the length. Now, the reasoning for that is the start and end points dictate the length and the angle. So that is the changeable feature. Similarly for a circle, now we can go in and actually change pretty much all of them. So we could change the radius, say to 20, and see how that changes everything else. But in general, if we have nothing selected, our properties dialog box is just showing us the general properties of what's going on in model space. So it provides your general view location, This is kind of the center point of your view, whether that's needed or not, but it's kind of a nice feature, because if you're wondering where you are in space, that's helpful. This is stuff for deeper drafting. It's not really relevant here, but there's annotation scales, there's different things about the coordinate system. And again, here's plot styles, but a lot of this isn't really relevant to drafting. What is really relevant, and what we're going to kind of shift into here, is this layer information. And just kind of briefly go over what layers are in general. But real quick, what I want to show you, so I'm going to get out of the properties dialog box. Now obviously you can click on an object, right click properties, we showed that. I always tend to use keyboard shortcuts because that's the way I learned them. And this one is kind of an annoying shortcut, but it's MO. Why MO is for properties? Don't know. Because M, and one thing to kind of get clear in your mind, M itself, just M, is for move. MI for mirrors. MO for properties. Now obviously you could physically type properties, but there is a keyboard shortcut, just MO. Again, that's kind of one of those random things that may be confusing to you, but I like to have this pretty much docked over here the whole time. So just as a brief aside as well, any of these toolboxes, or whatever you want to call them, dialog boxes, can be moved around. And to move them, you can't just click anywhere within them. You normally click where you see that's kind of a shaded area and where the name of the box is, and that's where you grab and you can move it around. So you could move it, you can stick it a bunch of different places, of course now, but I like to just keep it kind of docked over on the right side. And normally I just kind of leave this up all the time. I use it fairly frequently enough that this is a good thing to just leave open, assuming you have a wide enough screen that you can fill it full of a couple of these things. Anyway, so that's kind of a quick overview of that. So let's discuss what layers are. So each of these, any individual feature you draw into AutoCAD, we mentioned we click on it and it has these features. So we can set a color, we can set a layer, a line type scale, a line weight, transparency. So there's quite a bit, but if you notice, a lot of these are by layer, by layer, by layer, color by layer. Okay. Each individual feature can have individual properties here, and we can change that regardless of what layer it's on. So we can say, I want that to be red. Well, now it's red. Now, if you note where it's by layer was white, so that's the default for that layer. But I can just say I want that one to be green. I could change the line type, and there's a bunch of different line types. We can change it to a dashed line, these center line looking things. And I'll show you this real quick. So a dashed line, you can see we can change it to a dashed line, but those are pretty small. So we can actually change the scale of that dash and make it something bigger, and now we've changed the scale of how they make the dashes, essentially. Okay, so there's a lot of these. It would be good to just play around with them. This one's for fences, there's dots, there's all kinds of different ones. Okay, this is kind of a typical center line. Anyway, so that's built in there, and then your line type scale will kind of change the look of it and kind of the spacing of some of that. Okay, and we can change the line weight, which it generally doesn't show up until we print. So that one's a bit messier, but it's there. And transparency, again, it doesn't really affect it until it prints. But again, in our properties box, this is all about this individual feature, okay? And this features, or this object's properties. As we come over here, we click. Now you note, if we look, this is layer 0, but it has different properties than this, which is also on layer 0. So if you're confused about what layers are, then we're moving in the right direction, but we're about to get there. So layers, think of, now we can change individual properties of individual objects, but perhaps they're all the same. We're building an object, say excuse, we have all these objects. Say, let's just, for grins, we're just going to build a little house here. Okay, so there's our house. And let's just say, let's give it a couple windows and a door. So just something goofy like that. Okay, so there's our house. Now all of this is on the same layer, but for example, let's start, say, well, we want to draw like a little sidewalk coming out of there, and let's say we wanted to draw, say, a curb. And then here's maybe a fence. Okay, and then this is our yard or something like that. So if you think about, if you were designing something or if you were drawing something, think about the groups of objects we have here. We have things, even just basic things. We have all of these make up the house. So all of these individual objects, say that's our house. This is our fence. For example, this would be our yard. This is our sidewalk. This is the curb. If we were designing all these features, we'd probably want to design them one at a time, right? And maybe somebody, we want to present this to a client or whatever, or we want to print out different sheets. And so they say, well, I just want to look at the house. Well, they're all right now on the same layer, and we just have to see them all at the same time. But if you're really into design and stuff, sometimes you don't need to see all these other things. And so layers provide us that opportunity to establish each feature as a separate group. So we're grouping kind of our drawing objects. And because we can group them, we can manipulate the features of that group. So for example, let's just say this is our house. So we could set the house to be on a layer we called house, and we can change the colors of that layer, we can change the line types of that layer. So everything in that layer has a standard type, standard look. Same way with this fence or yard or curb, whatever. Now to do that, we come up here. Again, this is on the Home tab, and this is our layer properties. So there's a lot of buttons in here, and we'll kind of walk back to this in a second. But you just click the big layer properties, and it brings up this big dialog box or toolbox. Okay, And these are the layers. Everyone's AutoCAD may not look like this from the get-go. A lot of these are kind of we've built already, but there's tons of layers that are predetermined, pre-built, and even basic AutoCAD, Civil3D will have quite a few of these. Okay, but it always defaults and just creates this zero layer that's white and continuous line type default. But there's all different kind of layers. And you'll note each one has, at least right now, different colors. There's some with different line types. And all of them next to it have this little light bulb, sunshine, and a little lock. So that these are kind of the ways you can manipulate the different layers. So you're able to turn them on or off, where you can physically use them, see them. Similar with freeze, you can freeze them to where they basically quit showing up. They're still around to be used. Or you can lock them, where you could still see them, but you can't physically use them. Okay? And I'll kind of walk you through that quickly. So if you see a little check mark here, that means that's the current layer. That's the layer you're using. And so anytime you create an object, it's going to default to that layer. Okay? To set a new one, you come over here to this little shape and you double click and it turns. And so now you'll see right up here, it switches the current layer to this. Okay? So you can pick any of these layers to be your current layer depending on what you want. So just to briefly walk you through layers. So there's, if you see kind of an A in front of, these are typically architectural layers. So there's buildings, utility lines, property lines, things like that. There's a border layer. If you see a C, normally these are your civil engineering ones. So anno is for annotate, and we'll cover that in the next lesson. But for a lot of text and dimensions, things like that. There's hydrology, ones built in property boundaries, railroad, obviously we're not really working on that. Quite a lot of roadway ones, center lines, corridors, all kind of profile lines, section view lines. So quite a bit there. So we have storm sewer, stream, topo, survey lines. Quite a lot built in here. A lot of the V are going to be based on like surveys. So again, these are kind of, a lot of our defaults in AutoCAD, and some we have added as our defaults. But you can also create layers, and I do this quite often. There's a lot of stuff we use that's defaulted to the zero layer, so I don't like to use that one very much. In most of the drawings I do, I like to create a couple layers. Essentially, one is going to be a scratch layer, and I generally call that construction lines. And then another one I always create is a 2D line work. And so these are the things you've drawn in, but you need to manually draw in, but it's going to stay in the final plans. And because I'm kind of lazy and I don't like searching all the way through here, and it's essentially alphabetical but numerical first, when I create new layers, especially ones I'm using a lot, so you come up here and there's this little sunshine next to the papers, new layers, or you can use Alt N. And when I create a new layer, I actually type a 0 first and then a dash. And then let's just say, and I like to keep the similar format in all caps. I'll just put construction lines. And then I normally like to make one that is just called 2D line work. Again, this is completely up to you. And that way, when you sort by name, these are at the very top. So if you do a drop down, they'll be at the very top. They're easy to find and quick. It's not that big of a deal to scroll for a minute, but that's just my personal preference. And you can come in and set the color of each one. You can set it to blue. Set construction lines, say yellow or something like that. Okay, so you can move these around, and now let's just say I'm going to click on 2D line work and make that my current layer. Then we'll get out of here. You'll note both up here it now shows 2D line work, and over here in our properties it's 2D line work. We don't have anything selected. So now we could draw, let's just say, just going to draw, we'll call this a cloud, okay, just for grins. Okay, but now when I click on this, it tells me it's a polyline. Its color is the by the layer, which is blue, and it's on the layer 2D line work. Unlike our house, which is still on layer 0, and its color is by the layer. So we could work through and we could create new layers. We could call this one house. Maybe we'll turn it red. Okay, and we don't necessarily need to turn this one on, but we could highlight all the features in the house. And now you note, even in the properties, it tells you I've highlighted 5 different polylines. But over here, I can manipulate the features of those selected polylines. So if I come to layer, I can hit the drop down, and you'll note now those two I created with the 0 dash are right here and easy to get to, whereas the house layer, now I've got to scroll down. And because there's so many already built in, sometimes it's kind of a pain. So I could change this to house. And you see how it automatically adjusts the color based on that selection. But even though we selected this and we changed this to house, you'll note over here we're still in the 2D line work because that is the current layer. We just physically changed the layer of these objects. Okay, we didn't actually change the current layer. So if we drew something new, it would still be in the 2D line work layer. But now even I can come in and say, well, I want the house generally to be red, but I want the windows to be a different color. I can select those. And even though I see it's on the house layer, and I can say, well, you know what? I want those to be cyan. Okay, and the colors, just for reference, are the cyan and magenta are the kind of, computer colors. But you just have to get used to seeing them that way. And let's just say I want the door to be yellow. Oops. Okay, so I can change the colors of individual features, but they're still all on the same layer. Now you'll note, now that I've selected all these, I come over here, the color, it varies between all these 5 features. But what is constant? That they are on the layer house. Okay, so now, right now in my drawing, I have 3 layers. I have these as 2D line work. This is house, and then all this stuff is still on the 0 layer. Now, just to show you how layers work and how you can turn things on and off. So if I was giving this to somebody, maybe I don't want the clouds up there. So I can come and I can do multiple things. I can turn these layers off, or I could freeze them, and basically it makes them invisible. Okay, now if you look at turning it off, it completely turns it off. Okay, but it essentially does very similar things, turning layers off and freezing them. Um, I like to just use freeze. To me, it's just cleaner and works better. Um, so let's click on that, and we're going to freeze. So let's say I want to just make these clouds invisible. I don't want them to show up on my sheets. Well, I keep clicking them, nothing's happening. Now, that seems odd. Well, maybe I'll try turning something else off. Maybe I'll turn the sidewalk off. Well, that worked. Now you remember all of that extra stuff was on that one layer. Okay, and I can turn, let me see if the house works. Yep, it works. But I couldn't turn off this one. Now there's a reason for that. You cannot freeze your current layer. Okay, so our current layer is 2D line work. You can't turn that off or freeze it because that's the one you're working with. Okay, so that's why it didn't work. If I hit Control Z, then it backs up, undoes what I just did. So to turn the clouds off, I would just need to switch to a different layer. Now I can come in, freeze those, they go away. Okay, but sometimes it's really useful to be able to turn layers on and off. Now this is a pretty rough example, but for things where you have a roadway on your plan sheets, you have a lot of construction lines, and that's one of the reasons I like to use a construction line layer, because when you're drawing stuff, you generally have a lot of lines, guidelines, lines you trace around, different things like that, that you don't want to have to always go back in and delete those, because that becomes a pain, especially in a big drawing, to figure all that out. So if you keep them on a layer that you can just turn off at the end, then it's a whole lot easier to just clean your drawing up. So just as a review, obviously we've kind of gone through this, but I just kind of want to make the comment again. We have our layer properties dialog box, and over here we have our just generic properties dialog box, within which we can change layer information. But the layer properties covers the entire layer. Anything you put on that will be referenced to that layer, and it will have these default attributes. Now each individual object, you can manipulate those individual attributes, but retain which layer it is on. Okay, and that's the biggest difference between these two. There is overlap, but this general properties is based on the individual objects that you have selected, whereas the layer properties is for the entire layer as a whole. Okay, so we'll cover more about this in future lectures, but this is just to provide a brief introduction and overview as far as layers and properties go. So that's it for this video. I know that was a little long and dragged out, but hopefully that provided you a good basis. Thanks.